The dead don't wake up, at least, that's what the people of South Carolina believed. But on one stormy afternoon, a woman buried alive defied death itself, and what happened next changed everything. In a small town nestled deep in South Carolina, where traditions were as heavy as the air before a storm, a woman named Essie Williams Dunbar was pronounced dead. It wasn't sudden, it was expected. She had been sick for days, and when she stopped breathing, the doctor confirmed what everyone feared: Essie was gone. The town wasted no time. Funerals were swift in those days, and before her sister could even arrive, they lowered her into the ground. 3 preachers stood over her grave, murmuring prayers as the coffin disappeared beneath the dirt. Then, the sister arrived. Late. "Open it," she demanded. The people hesitated. "She's gone," they whispered. "It's too late." But the sister was stubborn. She would see Essie one last time. And when the coffin was pried open, Essie was alive. Smiling. Breathing. And that's when all hell broke loose. The sun never shined right on the day someone died. That was what the old folks said. And on this particular morning, the sky had a strange tint, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to be gray or blue. Inside a small wooden house, Essie Williams Dunbar lay on a bed, her skin pale, her breath shallow. She had been sick for weeks, a fever eating away at her, leaving only a fragile body behind. Her sister, Mary Dunbar, had gone to visit their aunt in the next town. By the time word reached her that Essie was sick, it was too late. The town doctor, an old man with thick glasses and a face like a disappointed grandpa, shook his head. "She's gone," he said simply, pulling the sheet over her face. And just like that, Essie Williams Dunbar was declared dead. No one questioned it. No one thought to check twice. The townsfolk moved fast. There were no embalming machines, no hospitals to hold the body. You buried your dead quick before the heat could take them first. And so, they prepared Essie's funeral. The day of the funeral, the town gathered around a small wooden casket, whispering prayers, shedding quiet tears. Mary Dunbar was still miles away, riding a horse-drawn carriage as fast as she could. Meanwhile, 3 preachers stood around the grave, their solemn faces full of wisdom. One was tall and thin, the second heavy-set, and the third, a man named Reverend Peters, was so short he barely reached Essie's coffin. The burial began. Dirt was tossed over the casket, the sound of soil thudding like raindrops on a roof. Then, a commotion. A voice. "Wait!" Mary Dunbar burst into the cemetery, breathless, desperate. "Open it," she begged, her voice breaking. "Let me see my sister one last time." The preachers exchanged uneasy looks. "You don't want to remember her like this," one said softly. But Mary had never been one to take no for an answer. With great reluctance, the preachers and the townsfolk pried the coffin lid open. And inside, Essie sat up. Smiling. Breathing. Her voice, light and airy, whispered, "Well, that was a good nap." It happened too fast. The 3 preachers screamed. Not just a little yelp, full-bodied, high-pitched shrieks. The tall preacher jumped backward, tripping on the mound of dirt. The heavy-set preacher tried to run, but his coat got caught on a branch, sending him tumbling. And poor Reverend Peters, the shortest of them, was shoved straight into the grave. The townsfolk panicked, scattering like leaves in a storm. Some ran. Some fainted. The graveyard became a scene of absolute chaos. Meanwhile, Essie just sat there, blinking in confusion. "Why's everyone acting like they've seen a ghost?" she asked, scratching her head. She had no idea she was supposed to be dead. Down in the grave, Reverend Peters groaned, trapped beneath the weight of the other 2 preachers. "Get off me," he wheezed. But no one helped them, everyone was too busy running for their lives. Essie looked around, her smile fading. Did I miss something? She asked. Mary fell to her knees, shaking her head in disbelief. You were dead, she whispered. Essie laughed. Well, I guess I got better. But not everyone thought it was funny. Because in that moment, the town began whispering. Some called it a miracle. Others called it witchcraft. And for the first time, Essie felt afraid. She wasn't supposed to wake up. And she had no idea what would happen next. The cemetery should have been silent, a place of mourning. But now, it buzzed with fear. People ran past headstones, their whispers turning into shouts. She came back from the dead, one woman shrieked, nearly dropping her child as she ran. This ain't natural, an old man spat, making the sign of the cross. Essie still sat in her half-covered coffin, her eyes darting from face to face. It felt like everyone was staring at her, but not with joy. With fear. Her sister, Mary, knelt beside her, gripping her hands. It's okay, she whispered, trying to mask the terror in her own voice. But it wasn't okay. The shortest preacher, Reverend Peters, was still trapped in the grave, groaning. The other two had finally scrambled out, dusting themselves off. And then, Reverend Galloway, the tallest of the three, turned toward the crowd. This woman was dead, he declared, pointing a trembling finger at Essie. The murmurs grew louder. What does that mean for now? He continued, his voice echoing. A miracle? Or a curse? Essie felt a chill crawl up her spine. Mary stood, facing down the preacher. She's my sister, she snapped. And she's alive. That's all that matters. But was it? Essie could see the way people stepped away from her, like she carried something deadly. Something unnatural. And deep down, she began to wonder, why had she come back? She should have been dead. And yet, here she was. Alive. Essie and Mary barely made it out of the graveyard before the whispers turned into accusations. Some called her blessed. Others called her cursed. And as they made their way through the dusty roads of town, Essie felt every single eye watching her. But one pair of eyes stood out. A man. He was lean, dressed in black, standing near the edge of the crowd. Unlike the others, he didn't look scared. He looked interested. Essie shivered. Mary, she whispered, nodding toward him. Who's that? Mary turned, following her gaze. Her breath hitched. That's Elias Grayson. The name sent a ripple of unease through Essie. She had heard it before. A doctor. A man who studied things that shouldn't exist. And now, he was watching her like she was one of those things. Essie pulled her sister's arm. Let's go home. They hurried down the street, but even as they turned the corner, Essie could feel it. His eyes were still on her. That night, Essie dreamed of the grave. She was back inside the coffin. It was cold, tight, suffocating. Dirt rained down, hitting the lid like soft drum beats. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Then, a voice whispered in her ear. You weren't supposed to wake up. Essie gasped awake, sweat soaking her nightgown. The room was dark. Silent. But something felt wrong. A shadow moved outside the window. Slowly, Essie turned her head. And there, just beyond the glass, stood Elias Grayson. Watching her. Waiting. For what, she didn't know. But something in her gut told her. This wasn't over. Not even close. Essie's heart hammered in her chest. Elias Grayson stood outside her window, his face barely visible in the moonlight. He wasn't moving. Just watching. Essie's breath hitched. Was he waiting for something? She shoved the covers aside and slid off the bed, creeping toward the window with slow, hesitant steps. As she got closer, her fingers trembling at her sides, she realized something. He wasn't just looking at her. He was studying her. A chill ran down her spine. Mary was asleep in the next room, but Essie didn't dare call out. Instead, she yanked the curtains shut, stepping back into the darkness of the room. For a moment, all was silent. Then, a knock on the front door. Essie froze. No one knocked at night. Not unless they had a reason. Not unless they wanted something. She backed away, her pulse quickening. The knock came again. More forceful. Then a voice. His voice. "Miss Dunbar," Elias called softly. "I'd like to have a word." Essie's blood turned cold. She didn't know why, but something inside her screamed not to open that door. Essie held her breath, pressing her back against the wooden wall. Maybe if she stayed quiet, he'd go away. "Miss Dunbar." His voice was smooth, but there was something off about it. "I know you're awake." The knock came again, this time slow and deliberate. Essie swallowed. Her hands were clammy, shaking. Then, another sound, footsteps on the stairs. "Mary." Before Essie could stop her, the door creaked open. Mary stood there, her nightdress swaying in the cold air. "Dr. Grayson?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. Essie felt her stomach drop. Elias smiled. "Miss Dunbar," he said, tipping his hat. His dark eyes flicked to Essie over Mary's shoulder. "The one who came back from the dead." Essie felt her mouth go dry. Mary folded her arms. "It's late, doctor. What do you want?" His smile never wavered. "I have questions." Essie's heart pounded. "I'm not sick," she said quickly. Elias tilted his head. "Aren't you?" Something about the way he said it sent a fresh wave of fear crawling up her spine. Mary hesitated, sensing the tension. "Maybe we should come back in the morning, doctor." Elias's smile faded just slightly. Then he nodded. "Of course. Morning it is." He tipped his hat once more and turned, disappearing into the night. Essie let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Mary shut the door and turned to her. "What was that about?" Essie shook her head. "I don't know. But deep down, she did." Elias Grayson wasn't here to help. He was here to find out why she was still breathing. Essie barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the dirt hitting the coffin lid. Every time she dozed off, she felt the cold hands of the grave pulling her back. By morning, she felt strange. Dizzy. Lightheaded. Wrong. Mary frowned when she saw her. "Essie, you're burning up." Essie wiped sweat from her forehead. "I feel fine." Mary grabbed her wrist. "You don't look fine." Essie's skin was cold. Clammy. But inside, she burned like fire. Was this happening again? The last time she felt like this, she had. No. She shook the thought away. But then, something worse happened. A sharp pain shot through her chest. A deep, twisting agony that stole her breath. She gasped, grabbing her ribs. Mary's eyes widened. "Essie?" Essie staggered back, her vision blurring at the edges. Her legs buckled, and then she collapsed. The last thing she heard before darkness swallowed her was Mary screaming her name. Essie's world was dark. She was falling, deeper and deeper, into nothingness. Then, a jolt of pain. She gasped, her eyes snapping open. But she wasn't in her bed. She was in a hole in the ground. A grave. The same one they buried her in. Her heart pounded. No, 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 this isn't real. She scrambled up, her fingers clawing at the damp soil. "Mary!" she screamed. "Help me!" But there was no answer. Just silence. And then, a whisper. "You weren't supposed to wake up." Essie froze. The voice was close. Too close. She turned and saw something in the darkness. A shape. A shadow. It loomed over her, its face hidden, its body half buried in the dirt. Essie's breath caught. It was her. A second Essie, still lying in the grave, her eyes wide open, her lips moving. "You took my place," the voice rasped. Essie screamed. She clawed at the dirt, trying to escape. But the hands grabbed her, pulling her down, down, down. And then, she woke up. Essie shot upright in bed, her chest heaving. Her skin was damp with sweat, her nightgown clinging to her trembling body. It was just a dream. But it hadn't felt like one. Mary sat beside her, wringing out a cold rag. "You scared me," she muttered, pressing it to Essie's forehead. "You just collapsed." Essie shuddered, still feeling the cold hands of the grave on her skin. Then, a knock at the door. Mary tensed. Essie's stomach dropped. They both knew who it was. The door creaked open, and in stepped Elias Grayson. His dark eyes flicked to Essie, sharp as a knife. "You don't look well," he said. Essie swallowed hard. Mary folded her arms. "She doesn't need a doctor." Elias ignored her, stepping closer. His gaze never left Essie's face. "You died," he said softly. Essie's breath caught. "And now you're alive." His eyes gleamed. "I want to know why." Elias sat across from Essie at the wooden table, watching her too closely. Mary hovered nearby, arms crossed, ready to throw him out if needed. "I know things like this happen," Elias said finally. "More often than you'd think." Essie's skin prickled. "What do you mean?" Elias leaned in. "You're not the first person to come back from the dead." The room went still. Mary scoffed. "That's nonsense." But Elias didn't look away from Essie. "You ever hear about the taken?" Essie's hands clenched in her lap. "The what?" Elias tapped his fingers against the table. "People who die but don't stay dead. Sometimes, they come back, different." Essie's heart skipped a beat. "Different how?" she asked. Elias studied her. "That depends." Essie swallowed. "Depends on what?" He leaned back in his chair. "Depends on whether they were meant to come back, or if something else came back in their place." Essie's blood ran cold. She thought about the grave. About the voice whispering in the darkness. "You weren't supposed to wake up." Her stomach twisted. "What are you saying?" she whispered. Elias's voice was quiet, but firm. "I'm saying, you need to find out what you are." Essie's breath came in shallow gasps. The room felt smaller, closing in on her. "You need to find out what you are." Elias's words echoed in her head. "I'm me," she whispered. "I'm still me." Elias just watched her. "Are you sure?" Essie's stomach churned. She wanted to tell him to leave, to get out of her house and never come back. But a tiny voice inside her whispered, "What if he's right?" Mary's voice cut through the tension. "You're scaring her, doctor." Elias sighed, rubbing his temple. "I don't mean to. But something unnatural happened here, and ignoring it won't make it go away." He looked back at Essie. "You haven't felt different since you woke up?" Essie opened her mouth, to say no. To lie. But then she remembered. The fever. The nightmares. The voice in the grave. And worst of all, the feeling that something inside her wasn't the same anymore. She closed her mouth. Elias nodded like he already knew the answer. "I can help you," he said. "But you have to trust me." Mary's jaw clenched. "We don't need your help." But Elias wasn't looking at Mary. He was looking at Essie. Waiting. And to her horror, she didn't know if she wanted to say no. That night, Essie stared at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the wash basin. She searched for something, anything, that felt wrong. Her hands still looked like hers. Her face, the same. But then, she noticed something. She leaned in. Her eyes. The brown color had always been warm, soft. But now, they were too dark. Too deep. Like looking into a well that had no bottom. Essie sucked in a sharp breath and backed away from the mirror. No. She was just imagining things. It was the candlelight, the shadows, her own fear twisting her mind. She turned away quickly, shoving down the growing panic. But as she left the room, the mirror stayed behind. And for half a second, her reflection didn't move. Morning came too fast. Elias showed up before breakfast, as if he knew she'd been waiting for him. Mary refused to speak to him, her arms folded tight across her chest. But Essie let him in. The two of them sat across from each other at the wooden table, a candle flickering between them. "I want to try something," Elias said. Essie swallowed. "What kind of something?" Elias pulled a small, silver knife from his coat. Mary jerked upright. "Oh, absolutely not." Elias held up a hand. "It's not what you think." He turned to Essie. "If you're really you, this won't mean anything. But if you're something else, then we'll know." Essie felt cold all over. "What do you want me to do?" Elias slid the knife across the table. "Cut your hand," he said. Silence. Mary shot up. "That's enough." But Essie wasn't listening. Slowly, her fingers curled around the cool metal of the knife. She lifted it to her palm. Took a deep breath. And pressed down. At first, nothing. Then, a thin line of red bloomed across her skin. Essie winced. It stung. But nothing else happened. No screams. No sudden burning. No sign of anything. She let out a shaky laugh. "See? I'm still me." Mary sighed in relief. But Elias didn't look convinced. He was staring at the wound. Essie frowned and looked down. And that's when she saw it. The cut was already closing. Within seconds, the skin knit itself back together, like the wound had never happened. Essie's stomach dropped. Mary gasped. And Elias whispered, "Well, that answers that." Essie stared at her palm. The cut was gone. Completely. No scar. No sign it had ever been there. Her hands began to tremble. "This isn't normal." Mary shot Elias a glare. "What did you do to her?" Elias didn't flinch. "I didn't do anything." Essie swallowed hard. "Then, what's happening to me?" Elias studied her, his dark eyes calculating. "Something woke you up from that grave, Miss Dunbar." His voice dropped lower. "And it didn't let you come back the same." Essie felt cold all over. Mary reached for her. "It doesn't matter," she said quickly. "You're still my sister." Essie wanted to believe her. But how could she? She wasn't sure she was herself anymore. That night, Essie couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt dirt in her lungs. Her body aching. Like she was still clawing her way out of the grave. She pulled off her nightgown, checking her skin for any sign of what was happening to her. At first, she saw nothing. Then, she turned her back to the mirror. Her breath caught in her throat. Fingernail marks. Deep, ugly scratches trailing down her back. Like someone, or something, had been dragging her down into the dirt. Her fingers brushed over the scars. They weren't healing. Unlike the cut on her hand, these remained. She thought of the thing in the grave. The whispers. You weren't supposed to wake up. Her knees buckled. She had clawed her way out. But something else had tried to pull her back in. Morning light barely touched the town when Essie walked into the cemetery. She didn't know why she had come. Her feet just led her there. Her grave was still open, a pile of dirt beside it. The wooden coffin lay cracked, splintered, as if something had forced its way out. She swallowed. Then, a sound. A shuffle of movement behind her. Essie spun around. An old woman stood between the graves, dressed in a tattered black shawl. Her eyes were white, fogged with blindness. But somehow, Essie felt like she was looking straight at her. The old woman tilted her head. You're the one they buried. Essie's blood ran cold. The woman took a slow step forward. You should not have come back. Essie stumbled backward. I didn't have a choice. The woman smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. The grave never lets go, she whispered. Her voice turned sharp. It always takes back what belongs to it. Essie's stomach twisted. She didn't belong in that grave. Did she? The old woman grinned wider, revealing rotting teeth. You better run, girl. Essie's throat tightened. Why? She whispered. The woman's white eyes gleamed. Because the dead are coming for you. Essie's heart pounded. The old woman's words clung to her like a curse. The dead are coming for you. The cemetery felt colder now, like the grave was still breathing without her. Essie took a step back. Who's coming for me? The old woman tilted her head. Not who. Her fogged eyes darkened. What? A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, making the headstones groan. Essie shivered. The woman took another step closer, her fingers twisting like roots. You don't belong here. Essie's chest tightened. I didn't ask to wake up. The old woman chuckled. It was a wet, rattling sound, like leaves rustling in a grave. That don't matter, she said. Once the grave takes someone, it don't let them go. Essie's breath hitched. What happens if it tries? The woman smiled too wide. You'll find out soon enough. And then, she vanished. Essie gasped, stumbling backward. The cemetery was silent. Empty. Like the woman had never been there at all. But Essie knew better. Something was coming. And she was running out of time. Essie tried to tell herself it was all in her head. The fever, the voices, the old woman's warning. It was just fear playing tricks on her. But that night, when she lay in bed, she heard it. The whispers. Soft at first. Then growing. Her body stiffened. The voices weren't coming from inside the house. They were coming from underneath it. She sat up slowly, heart hammering against her ribs. The wooden floorboards beneath her creaked softly. The whispers twisted, turning into faint scratching sounds. Like nails scraping against wood. Essie sucked in a breath. It was coming from below the floorboards. She swung her legs over the bed, planting her feet on the cold ground. The scratching stopped. Her throat felt tight. She took one step forward. And then, bang! Something slammed against the wood beneath her feet. Essie screamed. Mary burst into the room, her eyes wide with panic. What happened? Essie couldn't breathe. The whispers were gone. The scratching had stopped. But she knew they were still there, waiting. Mary tried to comfort her. Maybe it was an animal, she said, pressing a damp cloth to Essie's forehead. Essie shook her head. That wasn't an animal. Mary exhaled sharply. Then what was it? Essie didn't have an answer. But deep in her gut, she knew the truth. Something was trying to get in. And it had come from beneath the house. Mary sat beside her on the bed. We need help. Essie bit her lip. She knew what Mary was thinking. Elias Grayson. Essie had feared him before. But now, he might be the only one who could save her. She swallowed hard. Go find him, she whispered. Mary hesitated, then nodded. She grabbed her coat and left into the night. Essie sat alone, the candlelight flickering against the walls. The silence stretched too long. And then, creak. A floorboard shifted behind her. Essie went still. She wasn't alone. Slowly, she turned her head. Something stood in the corner of her room. Not a shadow. Not a man. Something else. Something that had crawled up from the grave. And it was watching her. Essie's breath caught in her throat. The figure in the corner didn't move. Didn't breathe. But it was there. She could feel it. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows over its form. It was warm. Its body was thin, almost stretched. Its limbs were too long, its fingers curling unnaturally. But the worst part, the part that made Essie's stomach twist. It had her face. Her own face. The thing tilted its head, its lips curling into a sickening smile. You weren't supposed to wake up. Essie screamed. She scrambled backward, knocking over the chair behind her. Her chest heaved as she pressed herself against the farthest wall. The thing took a step forward. The floor creaked under its weight. Essie's legs trembled. Run. Move. Do something. But she was frozen. Then, the front door slammed open. Essie. Mary's voice. Essie's head whipped toward the doorway. Mary and Elias Grayson stood there, eyes wide in horror. But when Essie turned back to the corner, the thing was gone. Like it had never been there. Essie sat at the table, shaking. Elias paced in front of her, his face dark with thought. Mary gripped Essie's hand, her knuckles white. What did you see? Essie swallowed hard. It was me. Elias stopped pacing. Essie's voice wavered. It had my face. A heavy silence fell between them. Then, Elias sighed. I was afraid of this. Mary's head snapped up. You know what's happening to her? Elias nodded. He turned to Essie, his eyes grim. You didn't just wake up, Miss Dunbar. Essie's stomach twisted. You came back wrong. Essie's heart pounded. What do you mean? Elias pulled out a chair and sat down. In rare cases, he said, when someone dies but doesn't stay dead, they don't return home. Essie felt sick. What are you saying? Elias met her eyes. When you woke up, something else woke up too. Essie's hands clenched into fists. The thing I saw, she whispered. Elias nodded. It's the part of you that was supposed to stay buried. Mary gasped. You mean she's split? Elias exhaled. Not just split. Incomplete. Essie's chest ached. She wasn't just seeing things. She wasn't just different. She was missing a part of herself. And now, that missing part was coming for her. Elias leaned forward, his voice low. It wants to take your place. Essie felt a chill settle into her bones. Mary gripped her hand. Then how do we stop it? Elias's face darkened. There's only one way. The silence stretched too long. Then he spoke. She has to go back. Essie's stomach dropped. Go back? Elias's expression was grim. To the grave. Mary's breath hitched. No. No, we are not burying her again. But Elias didn't look away from Essie. If you don't return to the grave willingly, he said softly, then the thing that came back with you will force you. Essie's blood ran cold. And she knew. She had no choice. The cemetery was cold. The graveyard was empty, except for the three of them. The wooden coffin still lay cracked, waiting. Essie's hands trembled as she stood at the edge of the grave. Her body screamed at her to run. To fight. To live. But she could feel it. Something shifting in the darkness. Waiting. Mary grabbed her arm. You don't have to do this. Essie gave her a shaky smile. I think I do. Mary's eyes filled with tears. What if you don't wake up again? Essie didn't answer. Because she wasn't sure she would. Elias handed her a small vial. Drink this. Essie's fingers curled around the glass. A sleeping draught. Something to make the transition easier. Essie took one last look at Mary. Then, she drank. Her vision blurred. The world tilted. Her knees buckled. And she fell. Back into the grave. Back into the darkness. And as her consciousness slipped, she heard it. The whisper. You weren't supposed to wake up. Then. Silence. Soft voices. A hand pressing against her forehead. Then, light. Essie's eyes fluttered open. She was lying in her bed. Mary sat beside her, eyes red from crying. Elias hovered nearby, looking relieved. Essie's heart pounded. Am I? Mary let out a shaky laugh. You're here. You're whole. Essie's breath hitched. She pressed a hand to her chest. For the first time since waking up, she felt normal. Complete. The other part of her, the thing from the grave, was gone. Buried where it belonged. Elias let out a long breath. It worked. Essie's lips trembled. I'm alive. Mary clutched her hand. You're alive. Essie turned toward the window, staring out at the rising sun. The nightmare was over. And this time, she was meant to wake up. Essie had cheated death, but it had tried to take her back. Her soul had been split, and the only way to make herself whole again was to return to the grave. But she survived. She won. And now, she could finally live.